Our next speaker, Natalie Evans Harris, is a sought-after thought leader on the ethical and responsible use of data. She has nearly 20 years' experience advancing the public sector's strategic use of data, including a 16-year career at the National Security Agency. She founded a community of practice now known as the Global Data Ethics Project, with more than 1,200 active members focused on strengthening ethical practices in a data science community. Ms. Evans-Harris served as Senior Policy Advisor to the U.S. Chief Technology Officer in the administration of President Barack Obama, where she launched the Data Cabinet, a federal data science community of practice with 200 active members across more than 40 federal agencies. Please welcome Natalie Evans-Harris.
I was told there's a clicker. Can you hear me? Okay. I don't like to stand behind podiums, so I asked for a mic that I can move around with. I'm Natalie Evans-Harris, and these are all the ways that you can get in touch with me. One of my favorite African proverbs that you'll see as a theme throughout everything that I talk about is that if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Everything that I talk about is around how do we collaborate and work with data to solve really hard problems. Clicker? Nope. Not clicking? Oh, because it's backwards. It's a beautiful deck. There we go. So what I want to talk about today is around ethics and opportunities. 20-year career, all centered around how do we realize the value of data and use it as people to solve really hard problems. So I've done a ton of stuff in that space. And who am I? I believe that through our collective power, data can transform the human experience. So most of my work is really centered around how do we bring together data across a variety of sectors to improve economic opportunities for individuals, in particular in the education and workforce data space. I focus on how do we increase access to data. One of the things I did after leaving the Obama administration was co-found a data technology company called BrightHive, where it's solely centered around building out an equitable data trust infrastructure that allows for data across the public and private sector to be shared and connected and linked in ways that help us understand whether the things that we invest our dollars in actually help people, right? And then how do we feed that loop back to continue to improve our social sector programs? I enjoy talking about how do we use data, and not just how do we use data in really cool and innovative ways like with AI, but how do we do so in a way that still protects the interest of the individuals we seek to serve? So how do we do this ethically and responsibly, and what does that look like? So what I did was I wanted to ask the community, what keeps you up at night? As we continue to use data to answer questions, as we continue to collect information about individuals and realize that if we really want to get to the heart of the problem, we need individual level data. How do we do that, but still on the other side of it, minimize unintended consequences? How do we still make sure that the questions that we're asking and the answers that we're getting are actually linked and solve real problems? And then how do we govern this data? So with all of this use of data, and somebody said before me, everybody does data now. Everybody's a data nerd. I'm a data nerd, but everybody's a data nerd because you can't really do much in this space, in any space, without using data for information. So how do we govern that responsibly? GDPR is amazing and did amazing things in the UK, but what does that look like here? What does that look like when we start to talk about what is the responsible ways that we allow for private sector and government to use data, again, for supporting individuals? And that can take many forms and situations, and regulation seems to always be the answer. But one of the things I'll argue is that before we can even start to talk about regulations, we gotta figure out a standard. Like, we don't even know what right looks like. So how do we regulate a space where everybody has a different definition of what's okay? And how do we give people the power to control how they use their data, which is ultimately what we want to do, when people don't understand the power of the data that they have? These are the areas that we need to start working on and we need to start concentrating on. By the way, this whole talk is just a brain dump of all the things that keep me up at night. and all the things that I do. I don't have answers, but I love to talk about it, right? So what are the challenges? Using data is hard. There's all kinds of different problems and challenges and situations we need to resolve because we're taking systems that we've used since the 1990s, upgraded them for the 2000s, but they're still not quite right for the future of where we want to go and how we want to have our relationship with technology. And those are technical barriers and cultural barriers. It's things like we've built our infrastructures today to silo data. We've actually set it up so that data can't be shared and can't be linked. And if you want to do it, it's really hard. But now we're realizing that as a culture, we need to share data, and we don't have the infrastructures in place that allow that to happen. So how do we solve that while still protecting individuals? How do we fix and upgrade our policies so that people are allowed to share? People are allowed to work with data, and it doesn't require 6 months of lawyers going back and forth to create an MOU for one specific transaction. That once you then get that, yay, but if you want your friend to help you on it, you've got to now go through 6 months through again to solve it again. How do we make these cultural and technology barriers easier so that we can work with data, so that we can use data in new and interesting ways? And do this while balancing the rights of individuals while we're trying to help them. Because building trust requires that we not only make data accessible and get our hands on it, but it also requires us empowering individuals to speak on how they want to use data. It requires establishing processes and clarifying practices. Because if you want my mother to say it's okay for you to use her data, she's got to trust you. And historically, we are a country that has not always been there to protect those that are most vulnerable. So how do we build that trust? How do we make it clear that the things I want to do with data are actually there to help you? And if we do something wrong, there's accountability in how to fix that. And then how do we leverage technology to hold us accountable? Historically, we've taught our technologists to be innovative against all other things, because all the rest of it will wash itself out. But if you've created that newest, greatest thing, that's your success. We need to start teaching our students, we need to start training the next generation that it doesn't matter how new and cool that thing is that you create. If you hurt, that's bad. And you need to think about when you use data to answer problems and solve questions, think about the data sources. We talk about bias in data, and a lot of that comes from, and I believe the previous speaker spoke on this, if you take biased data, push it through an algorithm, you're still going to get biased results. You're not solving the problem, you're just making it you're scaling the problem. You're making it a lot faster to cause problems. And then you don't know how it happened or why. These are no longer acceptable when you're talking about technology. And we have to do better about defining that common good. Representative Jordan from Texas, back in 1976, first African-American female to speak at the Democratic National Convention, spoke on ethics and our need for a common good. And the things she said then are the same things that we talk about now. We as humans want to do good, and we want to use technology to do so, but we're also a society that's highly political right now. How do we define what common good looks like and be able to explain that out so that you know if what you're doing is actually helping? I argue that it's public-private collaboration that is the answer to our ability to use data responsibly and build technologies that help and mitigate unintended consequences. That we can't do it alone. It can't sit in academia, and it can't only sit in private sector. It requires a collaboration and a diverse set of people coming together with their diverse experiences and thoughts to be able to answer these questions. It starts with investing in infrastructures that use data to support missions, and then building trust with communities. So it's not just a phone call to the other person at that academic institution who happened to do something similar to figure out where you should go next, but it's actually going into communities, talking to churches, talking to schools, talking to the people where they are so that they understand what you're doing and why you're doing it, and they can actually tell you what problem they need solved. And then developing ecosystems that can drive that impact, because everything requires something from a different sector. You need private sector to scale, you need government to protect, and you need academia to keep thinking forward and making sure that what we're doing is sound. it requires, and you need people, because if they don't like it, they're not going to use it. The current data infrastructure we live in today is siloed, lacks standards metrics, lacks internal analytics capacity, but yet we still want it to be able to help us do data-driven actions. It's a broken infrastructure, and if you want to have impact, you need to create an infrastructure that is more open and collaborative. It's an infrastructure that's vendor neutral, so that if the things that you want to do are really based upon the data, don't know how many private sector people are in here, but you shouldn't have to go wipe out your infrastructure and put in a whole new one from a different vendor. You shouldn't have to call up the vendor in order to be able to access and use the data that is actually yours. We need infrastructures that are vendor neutral, and we need standards that allow for the data to communicate with each other. This is where the open source community has been fabulous. They've not only talked about how do we open our data, but they've actually built out standards that allow for it to be interoperable. It's not always clean, it's not always pretty, but it's a start, right? And then we need to have intuitive views of outcomes and BI tools that actually help us to answer these questions. This is where the previous speaker talking about simple and easy and little data, this is where those come in. We as humans don't have to be able to look at troves and troves of data to understand what's happening. We should be really able to rely on systems to do that, and as humans be able to look at what they've done, understand it, and then judge it and question it, and then do something with it. I'm always hesitant about systems that take action on their own. I haven't seen good examples of that being done soundly and quality. I know there are. I just always have questions. Global Data Ethics Project. So one of the things I did coming out of the Obama administration was I wanted to find out what keeps data practitioners up at night. So when you start to use data and you start to try to answer these questions around improving economic opportunity, helping kids in schools, what keeps you up at night about the data that you're using? And so I worked with Bloomberg and Data for Society and asked the question on Twitter. And I got about 1,200 responses and then took that and created a community. I said, okay, how do we start to define what it looks like to behave responsibly when using data? And came up with a set of principles. I did not create any of these. The community did. I just created the space to allow for it to happen. And none of the things on the screen should be new or surprising, but these are the things that are keeping these practitioners up at night. This community still works today to now take these principles and turn them into tools and tips and techniques and identify ways to help people adopt these principles. Private sector organizations have taken these principles and created their own set of internal principles to define their cultures internally of what they value when it comes to using data. But it takes a little bit more than that, right? What does it look like to then take these principles and turn them from something that's not just a piece of paper on your cubicle or on your wall, but actually something that's ingrained into your cultures? And I argue it should be ingrained in all cultures. There are just some basic, fundamental, foundational things about ethics and the use of data that just apply. And it's things like self-sovereignty and informed consent, empowering individuals to control their data. We're not completely there yet, but you should always be moving towards making sure you've got informed consent and people have a say in what's happening with their information. Cooperation and collaboration, transparency and openness, and decentralization, flexibility, redundancy, and efficiency. I mean, these are things that you see across any IT technology field, but you don't see what it looks like in the data field as much. And this is where we need to get to if we want to start thinking about what does it look like as a data science community to do this and do this well. Because my fear is that we keep going down this path and we're just going to pull back and say, you know what, it's too hard and it's too risky and we're just not going to use data. Or the other side of it, we're just going to use data to provide answers to questions I already want the answer to be. So if I want to say the sky is red, I'm going to use data and prove to you the sky is red. Be damned your eyes. We're starting to see both. ethical design checklist. So one of the things we do at Bright Hive is we want to make sure that ethics is ingrained in the products that we deliver. So it's more than just saying we want to be responsible, we want to be ethical, but we want to have something that we hold each other accountable for. So we created an ethical design checklist. And it's just questions that across the teams, we have to make sure that we've at least answered, thought about, talked about, and addressed before we've deployed into a customer's environment. That's how we start to hold each other accountable. There's other things we do as well. In our data sharing agreements, there's a set of ethical principles that the data governance boards hold each other accountable for. And they created that, but we provided a foundational set for them to use. Because checklists aren't enough. They're great for increasing intentionality, but I argue that if you really want to see change in the way that data is used, we need to start looking at our governance infrastructures. We need to start looking at our governance processes. And that's the way that we look at how your data is protected, administered, used, and shared. So we need to really start thinking about how do we want data to be used? What does that look like for every individual in your organization to use data, whether it be internal in your organization or externally to support a customer? What are your processes and what are the things in place that define how that data is used, by who, and when? I come from the IC. We have strong data governance practices. We have posters that talk about you are a data person and responsible for the use of that data. When I left the IC and moved out to the external government, I was actually surprised by the lack of strong governance procedures around citizen data. I was actually surprised that we're still struggling with defining who can see what data when, and make sure that people get the data that they need in a timely fashion and in a way that they understand the responsibility of what they have as well. Traditional data governance is limited and under-resourced. I cannot tell you more often than not, when it comes to defining governance, a data sharing agreement, a data use agreement, whatever it is, I'm talking to lawyers more than I'm talking to the people that are actually going to be using it. That's a problem, right? Because the lawyers are there to protect the institution, as they should be. It becomes a legal, how do we minimize risk conversation and implications against the institution versus a conversation around how do we protect and how do we optimize and how are we transparent. The governance conversation changes because we don't have everybody at the table that needs to be at the table to talk about governance. It's isolated and it's short-sighted because lawyers work in a box. And I don't mean that negative, that's what they're supposed to do. But with data sharing and with data use, things change every day. Today, your problem is I want to be able to understand whether individuals going to school are getting jobs. So I want to understand program outcomes for a training institution. If a student takes my training program and gets a job, is it a job making more money than what they made before? Is it a career where they're able to continue to progress and feed their kids? I want to understand outcomes. But the next day we realize, wait, in order to really understand this, I need more than just wage data and training program data. I also need to understand tax data, labor data. I need additional data, health data. I need additional data in order to be able to do this. What it looks like today with existing governance processes is you throw the whole thing out and you start all over. You throw it out and you start over. What we argue is that the data sharing governance of the future, if it's equitable and sustainable, that means that you put agreements in place that allow for changes to be made based upon the situation. It's coordinated and allows for everybody that's bringing data to the table to have a say in whether they want to continue to have their data at the table without it busting everything up. It involves governance boards, it's involved collaboration, and it involves leveraging what exists to move you into the future and recognizing that data is not a transaction, but it is actually a tool to enable and support what we as individuals and people and humans with brains can do. There's also a technical infrastructure underneath, and it looks different for everybody. For our customers, it's typically a platform that allows for that data to be cleaned and linked in an automated fashion so that what the people focus on is leveraging the data. That's what our data trusts do. And we use open source and open standards because what we want to see is we want to see more people leveraging the data that we've been able to connect in new and interesting ways. So we work with all kinds of application developer partners, and we work with all kinds of cleaners and linkers and aggregators in order to create a situation that best meets the needs of those customers. And you can see our DTMA, our Data Trust Management Member Agreement. That's the data sharing agreement I was mentioning that also includes ethical agreements and how do we hold each other accountable for the way that this data is used. It allows for amendments so that if you need to change something, the board can come together, decide what that change will be, and then make it through an amendment. And it doesn't even have to involve us. You don't have to pay us, you have to do anything. The people who own the data manage the data. And monitors and sustains the trust. So one of the things we also put in is that you need to look at if the intentions that you had in bringing data together are the intentions that you're meeting. And if not, how do we make that change? So it's intentional in a feedback loop and intentional in continuing to iterate and look at what we're doing with data and how we're doing it and whether it's intentional and doing what we need to serve. And finally, so I've talked about trust, I've talked about infrastructure, I want to talk about impact and how driving impact requires collective energy. Because if we want to start to take pilots and move them to scalable solutions, it requires collaboration. It requires intentionally bringing together different perspectives to define what those shared needs are, to define those use cases, to provide technical assistance to help those that may not have the ability to invest millions of dollars in something, still be able to benefit from the technology and the innovation and the great things that are happening. And to collaboratively develop data standards, because we don't have a problem creating new things, but be damned if anybody wants to adopt something that somebody else created. We've got 1 million data standards for one set of for one set of data, instead of looking at how do we harmonize these data standards and how do we work together. Scalable impact requires a shared vision. And this is just more from the Representative Jordan quote. I won't read it to you. But it's really about, in order to scale impact and in order to realize the true things that we're investing in data to be able to do, all the things that we're sitting talking about today around big data and analytics and learning about how to use it, it's all about impact. And if we want to realize that impact, we need to have a shared vision of the impact that we seek to have. And it doesn't mean everybody in the world needs to agree, but can we get 5 people in a room with different perspectives to agree on a change that needs to be made and be clear about what that change will be? Because if we do that, then we have a direction that we want to use, and we're not leading with, I have troves of data and I just want to use it. But we have a purpose and a defined purpose in what we want to accomplish with it. Am I up? All right. That's me.
We have time for a few questions. Again, if you have a question, please come up to the mic, state your name, and keep your questions brief, please. And if you're on the other side of the room, I will meet you halfway.
You guys either loved it or hate it, right?
I do have a question.
Want to meet you? Okay.
Hi, I'm Melvin Fleming from the University of Maryland, College Park. My question to you is this. You spoke about the data protection over in Europe, and I worked over in Europe, so I'm very familiar with it. There's a fundamental difference between the U.S. and there. Over there, the presumption is you own your data.
That's right.
Here, the person who collects your data owns your data. Will you ever be able to, without a significant change in legislative ownership, will you be able to do what you're describing? It's all voluntary at this point because truly speaking, when people collect the data, to a certain extent, they do own it. They voluntarily, in some cases, take it, but they can do what they want to with it. And I think it's a cultural thing, but it's also legislatively mandated. I mean, they put people in jail over in Europe if they misuse data. There's not just civil penalties, there's criminal penalties.
I think that I think that there will be major legislation necessary, but I don't think it's going to happen now. Like I heard, I don't remember what the senator's name was, but he runs the Commerce Committee, and he came out and said there will be privacy legislation this year. We will put forward a privacy legislation. My concern is that we don't know yet. You talk about the difference in understanding what ownership is. We don't know what ownership looks like here in the US. Right now, the person who has the data is the person that owns that data. But in reality, where the laws are going at the state level, and even the conversations at the federal level, the ownership is in the people. And that organizations, if you collect data about a person, you need to be clear about what you're collecting it for and what you intend to do with it. And I've seen companies be taken down, be sued, and be wiped out because they used the data for intentions that were not intended from their collection. I mean, we see what's happening with Facebook now. They're starting to they're getting investigated. They're constantly being called in to explain what they're doing. I think that the culture is actually changing to say it is not sufficient that just because you collected my data, you own it. My concern, though, is that we're moving into the space of saying individuals own their data, but because of the way because of the way that we're set up as a country, what that means is that, and California is doing this, because I own my data, companies are now going to try to buy my data from me. And that's just as dangerous, because now you're commoditizing data. And that's a problem that we need to solve, I think, before we can get to the point of creating anything GDPR-like here. What we are seeing is IEEE and some of these other standards organizations are working with across sectors to start to define some standards for data use, are starting to set some standards up to say, this is what you're agreeing to when you share your data, this is what you're agreeing to when you're collecting data, and this is what data ownership looks like. IEEE is doing a lot of good work in this space. And then we're also starting to see some organizations. I was talking to Halcyon. I was sitting in something with Halcyon a couple months ago where they want to create something like a LEED standard for data ethics. So if a company has this stamp of approval, they are basically saying that this is what ethics looks like for us, and this is what we're doing with it. I'm more excited about that type of work than I am around legislation. I think we're too early. I think it's messy, and anything they put out now will probably be wrong because we don't have an agreement on what privacy or ethics or use or ownership or any of these other things look like yet.
Any other questions?
Oh, ooh.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation, by the way. I'm Linesh.
Hi, Lynette.
I hear all the data governance and the ethical issues, perfectly said, because especially when I see my son just punching in data on his phone and sending it out to I don't know where.
Yep.
I get that, right? Parent and being myself, being very concerned about the fact. But the dilemma I get into is being a data scientist or getting to become a data scientist, data is wealth, right? If there's data, you could do much more with it and kind of really get to all those analysis and predictions and so on and so forth. So how do we, or have we, when you make all these legislations and privacy laws or getting into that, we're also kind of thinking of balancing this out so that there doesn't come a time when the data scientist just keeps thinking, I wish I would have more data. Because that's everywhere. That's in every company you go to, or every place that you're getting into. Seeing Facebook now, with these issues going on and so on, I'm sure many companies may get into that. And what I sometimes fear that these companies would now start holding the data back, saying, no more. We'll have the data, we will not be sharing it or doing anything with it. I hope that the time doesn't come.
I hope not. And so I think that there's a lot of concentration around data collection and starting to govern data collection. And I argue our problem isn't with the collection of data, it's with the way it's being used. Every violation has been because somebody doesn't like the way data was used, not necessarily the collection. But we hone in on the collection and say Google's collecting all of this data about us. But you know it, and you still use Google products. You know it, but you're still on Facebook. I argue the collection isn't the problem. The problem is we as individuals become violated when we find out how you've been using the data and how you've intruded in my day-to-day life because of that use of data. And I'll say a couple of things. One, I have the same fear that because all of the data is now being collected by these private sector companies and we're starting to hone in on them and want to regulate them, that they're going to go, okay, I just won't share the data out anymore. And I don't think we fully understand the impact of what that's going to look like, but it's going to hurt. It's going to hurt when that happens. But I also argue that the privacy conversation that we have today with people like us in this room is really centered around protecting privacy in a way because of the way we've grown up. What I'm seeing in the next generations is the privacy conversation is going to be very different. They're actually not that big on, like they're fine with giving their, like, take my data, like I don't care.
That's exactly what my son tells me.
Yeah, it's like, it's just
Don't
not.
worry, don't bother.
Don't, like, use it. Like, use it and make my life better. The balance that we need to make sure is that there's some frameworks, some standards, some rules that can govern that use so that when we do give up this whole privacy thing, because it's coming, it doesn't hurt those that are most vulnerable. That's what I'm concerned about. I'm concerned that somebody, because they need money to feed their child, is now going to sell all their data, like giving up organs, right? That's what I'm concerned about. So yeah, I agree. I think that the conversation is going to be very different in the next generation, and I also have the same fear. I don't have answers for it other than let's keep talking about it.
Any other questions? Well, this will be the last question, and I'll meet you halfway.
Greetings and thank you. Can you envision that we use data to monitor the health conditions of our citizens? Many people die because of lack of access to doctor on time or a physician on time or emergency room. And we use data to know exactly what I do at every point in time. Why can't we use that to monitor my health situation, especially people with cardiac problems? Thank you.
Yep, so we can. It happens. Data, I mean, Alexa, she knows everything about you. And we're starting to see more health care companies. We're starting to see more healthcare companies create the apps for Alexa so that if you're having a problem in your house, you can tell Alexa, and Alexa will decide whether to call the doctor or call the hospital. She'll make decisions on your behalf. So we're starting to see that data collection and tools that can make those decisions are happening. I think that the HIPAA laws today make some of it difficult, and also I don't want to chip in me, but I think that we're starting to get to that point. It's already happening where healthcare has already taken the lead and started using Alexa and some of these other AI tools to be able to evaluate your health in ways that don't require you to go to a doctor's office. I mean, I held a health scare a couple weeks ago, and I didn't have time to go to the doctor, so I have an app on my phone that allows me to call a nurse in 5 minutes. And so I called a nurse and had a conversation with her over the phone in 5 minutes. That's our future. Done?